dietitians here at the Diabetes at Pro Healthcare, but I also work in our Diabetes Center as a certified diabetes care and education specialist. So this topic is near and dear to my heart. We are going to go over a bunch of hopefully helpful information today about how we can manage the foods that we're eating and some of the considerations to help keep our blood sugars as level as possible. But first things first, I want to make sure that we understand kind of what diabetes is and what is going on. Our diabetes is higher blood sugars or blood glucose in our bloodstream. And I always use the metaphor of our bloodstream as kind of our highway system. And when we have too many blood sugars in that highway system, it's kind of like traffic jams. So we think about rush hour traffic on I-94, the Brewer game is getting out, nobody's getting anywhere, we're all at a standstill, stopped. And so when we have elevated blood sugars, or we've got too many of those in this picture, too many of those white little dots in our bloodstream, it can cause a lot of damage and just kind of congestion in our body, which is what impacts circulation or can cause internal damage to our heart, to our kidneys. And so really, when we have diabetes, the goal is to manage those blood sugars at a healthy and appropriate amount so that we don't get those traffic jams and everything is flowing through the body the way that it should be. Food is one of the big variables that we can modify to help manage how many of those blood sugars are in our bloodstream at any one time. The other piece of this puzzle is really our insulin hormone. This is a hormone that our pancreas produces, and I like to think of it as that key that unlocks all the doors. Well, as we'll see here shortly, there's two main types of diabetes, and in the more common type 2 diabetes, it's really characterized by insulin resistance. Basically, what this means is the insulin just isn't as effective in our body as we really need it to be. And so it doesn't have the right keys. Those locks stay locked, and all those blood sugars can't get from our bloodstream or the highway system to their homes or to our cells, whether these be brain cells, muscle cells, organ cells. And so when that insulin can't open up those cell doors, that blood sugar builds up in our bloodstream, really has nowhere to go. From a lifestyle perspective, there are different ways that we can attack this insulin resistance and help that insulin to work better. From a food perspective, a lot of research is showing that the amount of carbohydrates that we consume and the amount of body weight or exercise that we engage in can have an impact on that insulin component. Diabetes, unfortunately, is very widespread in the United States. Over 1 in 10 people in the US, just from adults, do have diabetes, and scarily 21% of people with diabetes don't even know it. This is not uncommon considering that symptoms are not always apparent, and we experience them differently as individuals. And so if we are not doing our labs, we're not doing our follow-ups with our doctors, there's a good bit of folks that are we're missing, right? And we're not able to diagnose and start to make some treatment recommendations to help manage those blood sugars. The majority of our adult population with diabetes does have type 2, but a little over 1.5 million adults in the United States do have type 1 diabetes, which I will be going into what the difference between those are. And almost 10% of our county in Waukesha County is diagnosed with diabetes. Pre-diabetes, which are those labs that are creeping up. Some people might use the verbiage of borderline, right? I'm not there yet. I'm not on medications. I don't have to check my blood sugars, but my labs are starting to kind of creep in that direction. Almost 100 million United States adults have this pre-diabetes. Diabetes is a really expensive condition. The most recent numbers that we have from 2017 include $327 billion spent on diabetes. Please know that that statistic does not include gestational or the undiagnosed components that would go into that cost. And diabetes is the 8th leading cause of death in the States. Now, please keep in mind that our diabetes lives in our bloodstream, right? That's where our blood sugars are at. Blood goes everywhere. So I say that anywhere your blood can go, your diabetes can go, or those elevated blood sugars can go. And when we're getting those traffic jams in the back of our eyes, in our brain, in our kidneys, in our heart and arteries, in our just general nervous system, it's going to cause damage. And so really it's important that we try to manage those blood sugars as consistently as possible so that we prevent those traffic jams and prevent any of the long-term complications. So one of the handouts or the other PDF that I believe Ashley included on that email she sent out is a risk test for are you at risk for type 2 diabetes. This is through the American Diabetes Association. It is a simple 7-question kind of test to see what your risk factors are based on how your points add up. So for those that maybe haven't had their labs done in a while, haven't seen their doctor in a while, maybe you've got a family history, but nothing's kind of showing up yet, you can take this just quick couple question test and see kind of where you're at in terms of low or moderate or high risk for developing type 2 diabetes. How do we diagnose diabetes? Well, obviously it's that blood glucose value, and so we diagnose this through labs. The 2 most common labs that we will use are an A1C or fasting glucose. You can also use a glucose tolerance test, which is you drink this special sugar-based drink, and then blood sugars are checked at intervals afterwards to see how high your blood sugars are getting as your body is digesting and absorbing that special drink. The A1C and the fasting glucose are more common just because they don't take as much time in terms of being present in the clinic. This glucose tolerance test, we got to drink the beverage and then we have to wait, we sit, we test at these intervals. A1C and fasting glucose can be lumped right into your regular annual labs blood draw. Now, an A1C is a basically 3-month average. This gives us a really high level view of where the blood sugars have been over the past 2 to 3 months. And so that threshold for diabetes is a 6.5 or above. Pre-diabetes would be a 5.7 to a 6.4, and our normal ranges for an A1C are 5.6 and below. There's a special equation that we can use to translate what those average blood sugars have been based on this value. Your A1C lab test does not need to be in a fasted state because, again, it's looking at the last 3 months. So I always encourage folks and remind you, you can't really hide from an A1C. I have family and clients, oh, I'm getting my labs next week, so I'm going to be really good this upcoming week. That A1C is going to be able to capture everything that's happened for those past 2 to 3 months, and so we really can't hide from it. Versus a fasting glucose. This is when we have not had anything to eat or drink except for water for at least 8 hours. And this tells us basically how well the body is managing and maintaining an ideal glucose level in that bloodstream all by itself without the impact of food or beverage. The threshold for diabetes is a 126 or above. Pre-diabetes is fasting glucose 100 to 125, and any kind of normal fasting blood sugar is going to be 99 or below. Technically speaking, to diagnose for diabetes, we do need to have 2 independent labs. Now, this could be an A1C and a fasting glucose from the same lab set. It could also be a fasting glucose in June and a fasting glucose in December. Both are 126 or higher, and now we have that threshold for, all right, a diabetes diagnosis. What are some common symptoms if we have them? Definitely feeling more thirsty and urinating more often. Interestingly, this is the body's way of trying to flush out extra blood sugars that it knows are present in the system through the urine. Since our kidneys filter blood, if the body kind of senses that sugars are really high, it's going to give you those thirst symptoms. Hope you drink water. Too often I have folks say, yeah, I was drinking a bunch of juice, I was drinking a bunch of Gatorade. These are just more sugars we're putting in the system. But when we have that increase in thirst, drink a bunch of water, and now we need to urinate. Well, that urination does include filtered, the kidneys have filtered some of that blood, and so we're able to kind of pass some of those blood sugars through. Fatigue, just a real like kind of low energy. This is because all those blood sugars are having trouble getting into our cells. They're staying in the bloodstream. Well, the body can't use them for energy or convert them to energy when they're still in that bloodstream. We need to get them into the muscle cells, the organ cells, so that they can start to do their work. And so it's not uncommon that we feel really low energy and kind of tired. And then weight loss, as the body is urinating out all this sugar, well, our body is not able to absorb it and use it. So depending on how long we're going without diagnosis or how high those blood sugars are, some people start to see the scale drop unintentionally, and then changes in vision. So teeny tiny blood vessels in the back of our eyes that feed the health of the eye, when they get those traffic jams of high blood sugars, it definitely can impact vision. So folks might go in to see their eye doctor, and then the eye doctor does a dilation or does some specific exams and says, wow, there's a lot of signs back there that there might be some diabetic damage. We need to get you in to see your doctor. Now, those are some common symptoms. It doesn't mean you're going to experience any of them, which is one of the reasons, a big reason why some folks go undiagnosed for so long if they're not going for those regular checkups with their doctor and doing those regular labs. So our two main types of diabetes are type 1 diabetes. We used to know this as juvenile diabetes. This is not an accurate description. We use this because this type of diabetes was usually diagnosed in children or younger folks, which still happens, but we've got more and more people as adults that are getting diagnosed as type 1. And so really the defining factor for type 1 diabetes is that the pancreas is not making insulin. It's considered an autoimmune disease, and the body is just not making any or enough. And so folks with type 1 diabetes will need to be on insulin injections or an insulin pump for the rest of their life. Because their body's not making any. Type 2 diabetes, which I had mentioned is the more common at this point, is that the cells are just not using the insulin well. So the pancreas is still producing insulin, and in some cases producing a lot of insulin, but because of the insulin resistance in the body, it's just not opening the cells and getting those blood sugars where they need to go. And so from a food perspective and carbs, diabetes is absolutely impacted. The success of diabetes is impacted by the foods we eat, regardless of the type that we have. There's some slight consideration differences, but the big ones that we're going to talk about today are going to be carbohydrates. And then just in terms of knowing what our risk factors are, obviously we could do that risk test. Things that we cannot modify that are out of our control, the older we get, the increased risk. And I always like to remind folks, a 65-year-old pancreas doesn't always work the same way as a 25-year-old pancreas does, but we can't just go get a tune-up necessarily. So the age is going to be a consideration. If we've got family history, right, that genetic predisposition towards these conditions. If we've had gestational diabetes with a previous pregnancy, risk for developing type 2 diabetes increases by 40% later on in life. And then certain ethnic groups are at a higher risk for developing diabetes. The good news is there are some modifiable risk factors that we can manage on a daily basis. Staying at a healthy weight. Research shows that over 80% of folks diagnosed with type 2 diabetes would be considered overweight or obese. So managing a healthy weight is a great way to reduce risk. Diet, which we're going to talk about today. Staying active, smoking cessation, and then managing stress are definitely ways that we can reduce the risk or at least put off this from happening in our lives. So when we talk about diabetes self-management, there are 7 core principles. Healthy eating, which is the one we are of course going to talk about today. Also know that staying active, monitoring our blood sugars, being consistent with medications, whatever diabetes meds we might be on, problem solving. So a person with diabetes might have some different problems that they need to be solving on a regular basis in terms of identifying what's causing low blood sugars, what's causing high blood sugars, and being able to solve those problems as they come up. Healthy coping, this goes to the stress management component, and then reducing our risks, reducing the risks associated with diabetes long-term. So that would be something like eye disease, kidney disease, increased risk for stroke and heart attack, making sure that we're reducing those risks. What are the main kind of components to healthy eating with diabetes? Well, first and foremost, I do want to mention that there's not a one size fits all. Okay, and so I tell all my clients, I'm not going to give you a meal plan with 7 days of like, here's what you should eat, because I don't know your food budget. I don't know how often you're going to the grocery store. I don't know your cultural preferences, your food allergies. Like there are so many considerations that go into the food that we eat. And so the beauty is with diabetes management from a food perspective is that so many different eating patterns can be successful as long as we employ these kind of concepts that I'm going to go over today. So we need to be mindful of our carbs and definitely the quality of our carbohydrates. So we're going to talk today about complex versus simple, whole foods versus processed, and how that impacts our blood sugar control. Consider the timing when we're eating the different things, whether it be meals or snacks. Nutrition labels, which give us so much information about what's in the foods that we're purchasing and eating. And then, of course, portion control of how much of these different things are we consuming. So the three main types of carbohydrates that we have in our food system are going to be sugars, starches, and fibers. And you can see with the graph on the bottom that not all carbs are created equal. So sugar-based carbs like candies and Coke and different sodas and juices, well, these things get into our bloodstream super fast, which is great if we're having a low blood sugar. We need to get those sugars up as quickly as possible. And sugar is going to be in the system within 15 to 30 minutes. Starches, they're a little more complex of a compound, and so it takes the body longer to digest them. And so we can see with that green color hump that our blood sugars don't go nearly as high, nearly as fast. And then dietary fiber carbs are really our best friends because these digest at the absolute slowest rate. And then on top of it, not all dietary fiber is even absorbed. So some of it is going to kind of act as the broom through our GI system and end up coming out the other end and have no impact on our blood sugars. And then protein foods and then healthy fats and oils. These generally do not have any carbohydrates, and so we see that they have the least impact on our blood sugars. And so what we want to do when we're talking about how to build meals and snacks is really focus on those far right ones. We want to add a ton of fiber from specifically vegetables. We want to focus on good, lean, healthy proteins and heart healthy fats. When we incorporate our starches and sugars, we want to do so at smaller degrees, right? Smaller portions, which I will show you what that could look like kind of on a plate in a couple slides. But it's not about deprivation and removal. I have a lot of folks that come into my office and say, I was told I can never have potatoes or pasta again. I don't know about you, but that does not sound like a life worth living. I like me some potatoes and pasta. Your diabetes is just going to ask that you might do it a little differently than you have in the past. And we need to kind of balance the ratio of our plate a little differently so that we're focusing on the foods that are going to have a lesser impact on our blood sugars and have a smaller portion of those higher starch or higher carb foods that we can still enjoy and incorporate. It just can't be the basis of the meal. And so overall, when we talk about healthy fats, I really want you to think about plant-based fats, things like avocados, nuts and seeds, olives, olive oil. Hummus is a great option for a heart-healthy fat source. Your proteins, now these can be plant-based proteins like soy, your nuts and seeds, your beans and legumes, or even animal-based like your chicken, seafood, eggs, fish, pork. And then fiber, when you hear fiber, I really want you to think vegetables. Now, in the world of diabetes, there's a handful of veggies that we don't really count as vegetables. We put them in the starch category, and those would be potatoes of any kind, corn, and green sweet peas. So our little kind of like frozen or canned peas. And then this time of year, winter squash, like your butternut and acorn, are considered starchy vegetables as well. So I want you to put those potatoes, corn, peas, and winter squashes more in that green kind of blood sugar response. We're going to put those in the same category as our breads, rices, and pastas. But all those other veggies like your lettuces and salad greens, broccoli, cauliflower, asparagus, green beans, Brussels sprouts, mushrooms, onions, peppers, zucchini, carrots, tomatoes. I mean, all the beautiful, colorful vegetables that we have out there. Really want the basis of our meals and snacks to live in that space because of the carbs that we get from those vegetables. It's primarily dietary fiber, so it's going to have the least negative impact on blood sugars. Vegetables give us a lot of kind of volume on the plate. They generally have a very high water content to help keep us hydrated. And if we're trying to manage our diabetes, we may be looking for some weight loss goals, and focusing on more vegetable heavy meals is going to help us to lower overall caloric intake without having to sacrifice all the volume of food, right? We don't have to just eat a half cup at a meal time and be walking away from the dinner table or the lunch hungry. We can load up with a ton of vegetables, whether they be roasted, microwaved, steamed. We eat them fresh and raw. We're making salads. Maybe it's a veggie soup. There's so many ways to incorporate vegetables so that our meals can be these robust, big volume meals. So we fill up our stomachs. We just don't have to rely so heavily on the same portion of pasta or the same portion of rice to fill that space. And so then going into glycemic index, this basically means what is the impact of a particular food on your glycemic control or your blood sugar response. And we really want to manage those whole versus processed or simple versus complex type of carbs. And so when we think of simple carbs, we think of what we call a high glycemic index, meaning it's going to have a very high impact on our blood sugar response, like that sugar that we saw on that graph. So this is going to digest more quickly. It's going to leave us hungrier sooner. It's going to get into our bloodstream faster. We really want to try to create this most level blood sugar response. Well, fast digestion and absorption is going to create a big old roller coaster. So this is, of course, going to be our sugar-based foods, but also more highly processed foods versus whole or complex carbohydrates have a much lower glycemic index. And this is really where we want the majority of our carbs to be chosen from. So these are digested more slowly. These are going to leave you fuller longer. They're going to enter into the bloodstream at a much slower rate. So we're not getting that big roller coaster ride, but we're keeping things a lot more level across the day. And so your complex carbohydrates are usually the least processed foods. They are going to have higher fiber content. So again, like those vegetables, your whole grains, right? Wild rice or whole wheat bread or whole wheat pasta. These are just going to be more complex carbs because they've been processed less. They have a higher fiber and generally a higher protein content as well in terms of those whole grains. And as we saw on that graph, protein digests nice and slow. And so when we can incorporate these complex carbs that also give us a little extra boost of protein, that's going to further keep our blood sugars level across the day. So when we start looking at labels to kind of figure out where everything's hiding, I do have two formats of the nutrition label on the screen for you. The label on the left-hand side is the format that we have been using in the States since the 1990s. The label format on the right is the one that we are actively transitioning to. They have done updated research to say what are nutrients of concern, how can we modify this format so that it better supports the overall health of the American people. But the two things that I've highlighted here from a diabetes and carb counting perspective beautifully are on both labels, and they're both kind of in the same areas. So I really encourage you to start with serving size. How much of this food should I be eating or can I eat to give me how many grams of carbohydrates that we see highlighted in that light pink box? If we don't look at serving size and we just go down to carbs and see 37 grams, but then we end up eating 3 cups of this food, that 37, well, needs to be multiplied accordingly because we had way more than the one serving. One thing I do want to clarify, if we see up next to the 2/3 cup, there's 55 grams in parentheses. Some of my clients can sometimes get confused as we are trying to do carb counting and think that that might be the carb amount, and that is not. Anytime we see that gram amount next to our serving size, it's really the weight of the portion. So the FDA requires that we provide a household measure, 1 cup, 2/3 cup, 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoons, whatever it might be. The 55 grams is the very specific, if you had a food scale and you weighed this portion out, how much would the portion weigh? And in this example, it would weigh 55 grams. But we really care about that 2/3 cup because most of us have our measuring cups and spoons in our kitchens, and we can use that to be specific with the amount of foods that we are portioning out. And then we go down to say how many grams of carbs are in this food. Ideally, we're going to try to keep our carbs consistent across the day. So we don't want to kind of save up all of our carbs for a big, heavy carb dinner, because what do we think is going to happen to our blood sugars after that big carb dinner? If we want to keep our blood sugars as level as possible across the day, we really need to keep our carbs, our carb intake, level across the day. So being mindful that breakfast isn't 120 carbs, lunch is 25, and dinner's 175, you're going to see a lot of variability in your blood sugar response. But if we can keep it 30, 30, 30, 40, 40, 40, you're going to see a lot more consistency and lack of variability in how your blood sugar responds after these different meals. Now, to take it a step further, because we know that not all carbs are created equal, we can look to the next couple lines to say, where are these carbs coming from? So in the example on the right-hand side, we see that the carbs are still 37. Dietary fiber is 4 grams, which means that 4 of the 37 carbs are those really desirable, slow digesting fibers. 12 of the 37 carbs are those fast digesting sugars. And then I've included, or I've highlighted with the yellow box, a new line item included on this new format, which is giving us a little extra transparency to say, where are the sugars coming from? We know that sugar can be found naturally in certain foods, for example, fruits. So it gives it its sweet flavor. Why are apples and strawberries sweet and tasty? It's because they naturally contain sugars. But we can also add sugars, whether it be a food manufacturer or in our recipes. And so what the FDA has now required is that food manufacturers include this. How many added sugars have you put into your product? Now, please know that those added sugars are included in the total. So there's not 22 grams of sugar in this product per serving. There's still just 12. 2 of them were naturally occurring. 10 of the 12 were added by the food manufacturer. So for example, if this were, and it is not, but if this label were for flavored yogurt, we know that even plain yogurt is going to have some natural sugars because yogurt's made from milk, and milk contains lactose, the milk sugar. So even plain yogurt has 3 or 4 grams of sugar in it. But strawberry flavored yogurt is now going to have the added sugar from that like strawberry goo they put at the bottom of the little cup. So in this example, this would say that 2 of the 12 were lactose sugars and 10 of the 12 were strawberry goo sugars. Needless to say, we really want to keep our added sugars in our eating pattern as low as possible, and we want to focus on those higher fiber, lower sugar options, right? Those more complex, more slow digesting carbs while minimizing those simple or fast digesting carbohydrates. And one kind of fun, easy strategy as you're going through the grocery store is compare how much fiber to sugar. So the label on the left has more fiber than it does sugar. Okay, the label on the right has a lot more sugar than it does fiber, meaning that these 2 carbs or these 2 labels are not equal. The label on the right is going to digest at a much quicker and faster rate because more of those carbs are those simple sugars versus the label on the left has a much lower sugar content. So this is made up more of our fibers than our starches, which digest at a slower rate. Okay. All right, so the other kind of way to be mindful of our plate or our meal, why would the one on the right be only 1 gram of sugar? It's not the same food. So these were 2 different labels. They're just side by side, for example, but they're not the same food, to answer your question. Okay, so then another way that we can be mindful of kind of how we're doing our meal planning and do we have the right balance from a blood sugar perspective is what we call plate method. And so what you see here is half of the plate, we really want to focus on those low carb veggies. So those ones that I had described earlier, because these are very high in fiber, low in overall carbs, low in calories. So these are, roasted broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, or maybe it's a big salad. You're having carrot sticks and celery sticks. We really want 50% of that plate to be those good low carb veggies. Quarter of the plate, your protein of choice. We do want to try and choose the lowest fat or the highest quality proteins. Just because fat doesn't impact blood sugars doesn't mean the type of fats we consume aren't part of our diabetes journey. Diabetes and cardiovascular disease can kind of go hand in hand for folks. The risks are there. And so we do need to be mindful of the types of fats we're consuming. And a lot of times the fats that we get from animal-based foods like highly marbled steaks or chicken skin are just going to be higher in our saturated fats, which aren't so great for the heart. So we want to choose those lower fat proteins, our skinless chicken breast, those seafood options, egg whites, lower fat dairy products, or like cottage cheese, for example. That could be a higher protein. And then in your top right corner, we're going to have our grains and starchy vegetables. Reminder, those starchy vegetables are potatoes, corn, peas, and winter veggies. they would find themselves in that top quadrant. Our fruit and then your milk or yogurt are going to be higher in those carbohydrates. Do know that cheese and cottage cheese are usually much lower in carbohydrates because of their processing and aging. There's just not as much lactose left in that final product versus our more fresh dairy products like glasses of dairy milk or our Greek or regular yogurts. So we of course want to check the labels on those. But know that our fruits, dairy, grains, and starchy vegetables are typically where our highest carb options are going to be. So if when we're plating up, we can have this kind of ratio on our plate, we are doing a better job at making sure that we're not bombarding the system with too many carbs at one time, that it's going to lead to that blood sugar rise. Some additional considerations aside from just labels and carbs themselves. One is the timing of when we are eating. And so this is important because we have what I call our backup generator. And your backup generator is your liver. The liver does a lot of amazing things. One of the things it's responsible for is making blood sugar when our body needs it. And so, for example, in the middle of the night when we sleep, and hopefully not getting up in the middle of the night and having midnight snacks, but we might go 8, 10, 12, 14 hours without any new food or fuel. Well, our brain is still going and our heart's still beating and our lungs are still breathing, and they need energy to do that. Well, the liver is this awesome organ that can make blood sugars in the absence of food to keep all those processes going. Unfortunately, in type 2 diabetes, for any number of reasons, we don't have the same blood sugar control, as tight of control when the liver gets involved. And so if we can time our meals during our waking hours to prevent the liver from thinking it needs to kick on and start making blood sugars in the background for us, this can help to keep our blood sugars more level. And what I say, kind of keep us in the driver's seat of when blood sugars are being made and how many from the foods we're consuming. So ideally, we would space our meals 4 to 5 hours apart, because we know that after 5 hours is when the liver starts to want to kick on and start making us some sugars. So if we're going to eat breakfast at, 7, 8 o'clock, we want to make sure that lunch is by noon and then dinner is by 5. If we know we're going to go longer stretches than those 5 hours, the incorporation of snacks can help to bridge the gap between those longer periods. Let's say that you wake up really early and you eat breakfast by 5 a.m., but you don't get a lunch break until noon. Having a morning snack, let's say around 9:30, 10 o'clock, something small, something balanced, can help to prevent the liver from wanting to turn on in those later morning hours. By the time you get to lunch, blood sugars might already be creeping up all by themselves. Now, this liver component can be problematic for folks for their morning blood sugar checks. And what this is called is dawn phenomenon. It is not uncommon that a person can eat dinner, not eat anything else before bed. They check their blood sugars, let's say it's a 110. They don't eat anything or drink anything all night. They wake up the next morning and they check and it's a 130. Where in the world did these 20 blood sugars come from? I haven't had anything to eat or drink. Well, it's dawn phenomenon, and that's the liver production of blood sugars that's causing those numbers to start to rise all on its own. From a food perspective, the amount of carbs and the timing that we eat the night before can help to moderate that. So some people find that eating later in the night actually causes higher blood sugars versus if we eat an earlier dinner, timing of that evening snack. But when it comes to dawn phenomenon, more often than not, food aside, either medications, hydration, or exercise are going to be components that can help moderate that while we sleep. Consistency. The body likes to be proactive, not reactive. And so if every day we're eating at different times and we're all inconsistent, the body doesn't really know how to prepare. But if we can get into a rhythm where I eat breakfast by 7, I eat lunch by noon, I have my afternoon snack by 4, and dinner's by 7, and we can do this consistently, this can really help the body to moderate and manage those blood sugars. We also, again, want to be consistent with our carb intake. Little bit, little bit, little bit. We don't want to have a high, heavy carb breakfast and then skip carbs the rest of the day. We also don't want to save up all of our carbs for a Friday fish fry. because when we eat all those carbs at once, we're going to get those blood sugar rises. Physical hunger versus habit. This is something that I find a lot of people do need to think about. It's a new concept of, am I actually hungry or do I just want to eat? Just because we think about food or just because it sounds good to us doesn't necessarily mean our body needs it. And so as we're trying to make changes and improvements with our diet and our diabetes, identifying our portions, are they the size they are because they've always been that way? Or because my body needs that much food, right? How full are we at the end of the meal? If we feel like we got to roll ourselves over to the couch, your portion was too large. And so your physical hunger, you kind of overfed it. Same thing with snacks. Am I snacking at these different times of day? Am I having a bedtime snack because I've always done it because it's a habit? Or am I physically hungry and do I need it, right? And so just because we think about it or it sounds good or we see it or we know it's going to taste good, if our hunger is living up in this space exclusively and we aren't feeling it down below, we're not feeling it in our stomach, we're not feeling hungry, then this would be an area that we can definitely pull back, either skipping that snack or choosing a smaller portion to better match our hunger cues. Not only is this going to help improve our blood sugar so they can't get as high, but this can also help with weight loss efforts, right? We don't go to the gas station and put gas in the car when the tank is full. But we really don't need to be eating when we're not hungry. We need to be eating when our tank is at empty. Because if we just continue to put stuff in there and we're still, half or full, the body's not going to have anywhere to put that except for on us. And then hydration. So do know that dehydrated individuals generally find it harder to manage their blood sugars. We want to make sure that we're drinking plenty of water across the day or hydrating fluids so that our body can process those blood sugars better. In terms of hydration, your best choices are going to be, of course, freestanding water. If you're not a fan of the flavor of water, you can always naturally infuse it with lime, lemon slices, cucumber, basil, right? Those low carb things that'll give it some good flavor and taste. Seltzers. These are very popular in the marketplace, from your LaCroix and your bubblies, right? They don't have any additives. They're just, like a soda stream, just carbonated water. And then your decaf black coffees and decaf teas. Do know that caffeine is a diuretic or acts as a diuretic, so it forces the body to urinate out fluids it wouldn't otherwise. And so we really can't count our caffeinated drinks as hydrators because the body's just going to want to flush those things out. So if you're a person that likes to drink kind of a whole pot of coffee over the day, maybe we cut that back to 1 or 2 cups in the morning and then we switch to decaf so that we're getting the hydration benefit of that fluid. For those that are doing glucose, what amount of water a day? That's going to vary on the person. It depends on if you have renal conditions, what kind of medications you're on. 64 fluid ounces is a good baseline for folks that don't have any comorbidities. Half of their body weight in fluid could be a good gauge. But do know that there is fluid and water content in various foods. So the more fresh vegetables, the more broth-based soups that we consume, those do count towards our fluid or hydration status. So glucose monitoring. There are 2 kind of main ways that we can check our blood sugars, and that's either through finger sticks or what's becoming, more mainstream are continuous glucose monitors, or those sensors that you might see on TV. And so I thought it was interesting to pull this example of a person that was wearing a CGM, or a continuous glucose monitor. In this case, it's the Libre that you see on TV. They're wearing the thing on the back of their arm. And we can compare Saturday, the top circle, we had a bowl of Honey Nut Cheerios for breakfast, and you can see that blood sugar response, right? If we think about what is a bowl of Honey Nut Cheerios, well, we know that the Cheerios themselves are starches. The fact that they're honey nut means that they have sugar added, and then we're going to add milk, which is also a carbohydrate, right? So we don't really have potentially any fat in there. We don't have any protein in that breakfast. Moderate fiber from the Cheerios, but it's primarily a sugar and a starch-based meal. And we saw that this person's blood sugars went right up. Versus on Monday, the same person had a breakfast that consisted of eggs, lower carb toast, and some fresh strawberries. And you can see their blood sugar response is pretty flat, right? The eggs are a source of fat and protein. The low carb toast is going to be a lower carb option, right? And then the strawberries being a fresh produce, they are a source of fiber, and strawberries are a lower sugar fruit. And so we put that balanced meal together, and boom, this person's blood sugar stayed very level. And so this is a benefit for folks that do have access to glucose meters, whether it be these sensors or even if you have, a finger stick model, is on occasion checking your blood sugar after you eat different meal combinations to learn which of these meals are causing my blood sugars to go higher or lower. Generally speaking, if we are ever going to check after meals, we are going to check about an hour and a half to 2 hours after the meal. So if we sit down to breakfast at 8, we would pull out that meter at about 9:30, 10 o'clock, because this has given the body time to process through and absorb, digest that meal, and start to convert those carbs into blood sugars. We don't want to eat the meal at 8 and then check the blood sugar at 8:30, because we're going to likely have a false low or a false lower blood sugar because we haven't given our body enough time to process the majority of that meal and get those carbs converted to blood sugars. So we do have to wait a little bit of time. This is not something anybody necessarily has to do, but for folks that do have access to these tools, sometimes it's really eye-opening as we're trying to figure out, what combinations work better than others. Nutrition and medications in diabetes. So first and foremost, food is incredibly important to treat hypoglycemia. Hypoglycemia is defined as low blood sugar. And for most people, a low blood sugar is anything less than 70. Now, little rule of thumb I like to use is the older we get, the higher the risk of a low. And so you really never want your blood sugar lower than your age. So if you're 85, you don't want blood sugars lower than 85. But clinically speaking, hypoglycemia is less than 70. And if our blood sugars are indeed less than 70, we need to treat it. We need to get those blood sugars up. And the way we do that through food, and this is the time that we use sugar, because it gets into the bloodstream faster than anything else. And the most controlled way to do this is what we call the rule of 15. So let's say that we are kind of feeling off and we're like, I don't know, it's been a while since I've had anything to eat. Maybe I'm having a low. I'm feeling kind of shaky. I'm feeling sweaty. I'm feeling off. So I check my blood sugar. I'm at a 65. Okay, I have a low. I need to employ the rule of 15. This says that I need to consume 15 grams of sugar. So this might be 4 ounces of regular juice or soda. My personal favorite are glucose tabs. These are these little chalky, like they kind of remind me of like Flintstones vitamins, right? Because they're just like, you're not really excited about them, but they're just pure glucose. And they're small enough to fit in a pocket, in a purse, in a glove compartment, in your nightside table. They're shelf stable. You pop 4 of those in, and it's equivalent to approximately 15 grams of pure glucose. And within 15 minutes, those sugars should be getting into your bloodstream and converting to blood sugar. So the rule of 15, 15 grams of sugar, I wait 15 minutes, I check my blood sugar again, and I make sure I'm up above 70. If I'm not above 70, I repeat the process. Another 4 glucose tabs or another 4 ounces of juice, another 15 minutes, and I check again to make sure I'm above 70. And then the trick after we get our blood sugars back up is to either, if it's time for it, eat a balanced meal with our proteins and our fats and our good carbs. Or if it's not time for a meal, I want you to have a little bit of protein. So this might be a spoonful of peanut butter, a piece of cheese, a hard-boiled egg. A little bit of protein after we treat that low blood sugar can help to stabilize the numbers so they don't then drop again all on their own 15, 30 minutes later. Another time that nutrition and carbs are really important is with insulin dosing. We had a suggestion that 1 apple works because it's about 15 grams of sugar. Yes, hold please. When we talk about an apple, this is a teeny tiny apple, okay? Let's see, palm of my hand, it's very small. This is equivalent to 15 grams of sugar. Your standard Honeycrisp apples in the grocery store or most apples nowadays are easily 25 to 30 carbs, if not more, just based on their size. And then when we are doing the rule of 15 or treating, we really want to minimize anything that's not sugar. So we want to minimize fiber. We don't necessarily want to do a more complex carb just because it will digest at a slower rate versus just sugar itself. So for insulin dosing and carbohydrate intake, for folks that are type 1, they might use an insulin to carb ratio, or folks with type 2 that are on insulin, they might dose their insulin based on the amount of carbs they're intending to eat at a meal. And so we call this an insulin to carb ratio. If I eat 15 grams of carbs, how many units of insulin do I need to take to match that, right? So that I don't have a high or I don't have a low. And then we can use our after meal blood sugar response, back to that example of the Honey Nut Cheerios or the eggs. If I went really high after the meal, maybe I didn't give myself enough insulin. If I went low after the meal, I gave myself too much insulin for the amount of carbohydrates that I ate. So medications like insulin are really important for our nutrition and carbs. Know that there are other oral diabetes meds that can cause lows. A really common one is your sulfonylureas, so something like glipizide or glimepiride are common diabetes meds. Usually folks will take them at breakfast or with their breakfast meal, but based on its mechanism of action, if we don't eat enough carbs or we skip meals, the risk of going low is greater later on in the day. So based on the diabetes medications you might be on, it's really important to understand how they work and if there's a risk for going high or low based on the things that we're eating. I did want to include on here some resources. So the American Diabetes Association has a really extensive website, but they also have a really great recipe database websites there. The Diabetes Food Hub is another awesome recipe database. The CDC has a ton of great information, very thorough about diabetes management. And then the two websites at the bottom, a variety of articles, and there's folks that are living with diabetes and forums and supports and just really great kind of online resources to reach out. I will tell you here at Pro Healthcare, we have a variety of diabetes support options as well. I know that Ashley had mentioned at the beginning of this that her department offers an evidence-based diabetes program over a handful of weeks that I think she's going to include a link to when she sends out her info after this. Also know that we have a diabetes program with dietitians like myself and certified diabetes educators that can go through really anything diabetes related. So we can provide more individualized nutrition recommendations, talk about meters and how to check your blood sugar, understanding more about the medications that you're on, just answering questions about anything and everything related to your diabetes. So we offer individual appointments, and we also have a 4-week comprehensive diabetes education class that we offer here at the hospital. For our clinic at Pro Health, we do require a referral from your doctor to schedule with us, whereas I believe Ashley's really anybody can schedule and get more information. And I did want to mention for anybody on this call that's on Medicare, and specifically a plan, your Part B plan, with a diabetes diagnosis, the diabetes education with a registered dietitian and a diabetes educator are considered covered annual benefits. Now, your out of pocket in terms of like a premium or a deductible can of course vary, but access to this clinic here at Pro Health is something that your Medicare Part B plan should be able to kind of cover for you. And so you can either reach out to your plan and ask them specific questions or just ask your doctor to put a referral in, and anybody here at the clinic would be able to help answer questions about what we offer and what that would look like.